Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Vikings who believed dying in battle was a professional achievement. And yet there was one tribe that made Vikings quietly reconsider their plans. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Vikings were not supposed to feel fear. Picture this. It's 875 AD. A Viking longship cuts through dark water, or is pulling hard against a current. The vessel is sleek, designed for exactly this kind of work. Shallow drafts, lightweight construction, perfect for penetrating rivers deep into unfamiliar territory. On deck, warriors stand ready, scarred, confident, unstoppable. They're dressed for violence. Leather armor stained with years of wear, helmets without guards, weapons worn from use but sharp from constant maintenance. These men have done this 100 times. They know the formula. They perfected it. Land somewhere unexpected. Strike before local defenders can organize. Kill swiftly. Take what's valuable. Disappear back to the ships before any organized military response can form. It's worked in Paris. It's worked in England. It's worked against dozens of settled peoples who never expected violence to arrive from the water, never had time to mount effective resistance, never managed to do anything but watch their settlements burn and their people suffer. The reputation alone is half the weapon. Entire coastal towns surrender before a single Viking blade is drawn. That reputation has been earned through decades of success, through stories that spread faster than the Vikings themselves, through a demonstrated pattern of inevitable victory that seems almost supernatural. The Vikings aren't just warriors. They're the nightmare that every medieval settlement fears. They're the ones who arrive without warning, who seem unstoppable, who leave devastation in their wake. But this time, something different happens. As the ship cuts inland, the landscape transforms. The river narrows. The forest opens up on both sides, dense and unknowable. The water becomes shallow. Navigation becomes more difficult. The Vikings adapt. They've navigated trickier terrain before. They maintain formation. They stay alert. But there's a tension in the air that the experienced among them recognize. The wrongness of a place where the usual advantages don't seem to apply as cleanly. And then, in the distance, a sound, not a war horn, not shouting, not the disorganized chaos of local fighters scrambling to defend their homes. Something else. A distant rumbling that grows steadily louder as the minutes pass. It's methodical, organized, terrifying in its regularity. Thunder, but not from the sky. Horses, many horses, moving with discipline and purpose, moving with the weight of professional coordination. The sound builds. Dust rises from the tree-line. And then, like a curtain drawing back to reveal a stage, they emerge. Not a disorganized mob of local defenders, not scattered warriors gathered hastily. This is formation, cavalry arranged in deliberate patterns, multiple tiers, some armored heavily, some moving with incredible speed and lightness, officers visible, directing movement with hand signals and commands. The whole thing moving like a single organism rather than hundreds of individual soldiers. The Vikings know war. They know violence. They've encountered military forces. But what they see isn't war the way they understand it. It's something else entirely. Something systematic. Something that suggests they're not facing warriors as much as they're facing a machine. These are the Khazars. And in that moment, the Vikings realize something that will reverberate through their understanding of the world. There's an enemy here that refuses to fight the way we expect to be fought. There's an enemy here that is prepared for exactly this. There's an enemy here that doesn't look frightened or disorganized. There's an enemy here that looks like it knows exactly what it's doing. For the first time in their careers, many of these Vikings will consider the possibility that they might lose. Not that they might be defeated in glorious battle. That's something every warrior accepts as a risk. But that they might be torn apart by an opponent who refuses to engage on terms where their strength and skill can matter. An opponent who will kill them from a distance. An opponent who will prevent them from reaching their ships. an opponent who will turn the entire landscape into a weapon against them. That's a different kind of fear. That's the fear of a system that you don't understand. That's the fear of realizing, too late, that your understanding of how warfare works might be incomplete. That's the fear of mortality, but not the mortality you signed up for when you became a warrior. This is a mortality that comes from fighting an enemy that has already figured out how to defeat you before you even arrived. The legacy of invincibility. To understand what makes this moment so shocking, you need to understand what the Vikings had become by the 9th century. For roughly 200 years before this encounter, Vikings had been conducting a masterclass in military success. They'd emerged from Scandinavia not because they were more numerous than other peoples, not because they had better technology than the Byzantines or the Islamic powers, but because they understood something crucial about medieval warfare. Speed and surprise are force multipliers that can overcome numerical disadvantage. The Viking military model was elegant in its simplicity. Build ships that can navigate rivers and shallow coastal waters. Train warriors to coordinate in small groups. Hit settlements before they can defend themselves. Retreat to ships if real military forces arrive. Repeat until wealthy. It was pragmatic, effective, and it had worked everywhere they tried it. The Vikings understood something about war that many contemporary forces had missed. They understood that morale matters more than equipment. They understood that a disciplined, confident force can defeat a larger but demoralized force. They understood that reputation itself is a weapon. If potential victims believe you're unstoppable, many will surrender without fighting, which is vastly more profitable than actual combat. Their cultural identity was built around this military dominance. From childhood, young Vikings absorbed stories of great warriors, epic victories, the glory of dying in battle with weapon in hand. Every settlement they raided reinforced their belief in their own invincibility. Every successful escape with plunder confirmed their tactical approach. Every generation of young warriors grew up believing that they represented a new form of warfare that the rest of the world hadn't figured out how to counter. This wasn't arrogance exactly. It was confidence built on repeated success. And repeated success had earned them a degree of military license. They could attempt things that would seem suicidal for other forces. They could raid settlements far from their bases. They could push deep into unfamiliar territory. They could take risks that would destroy a less confident force because they'd learned that confidence itself was often justified by outcomes. The broader Viking expansion reflected the success. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were settling. They'd established themselves in Normandy, where they would eventually become Normans and eventually conquer England. They'd established themselves in Iceland, Greenland, and briefly in North America. They'd established trading posts and settlements throughout the Mediterranean. They'd expanded eastward into Russia, establishing outposts along river systems that flowed toward the Islamic world and toward wealth beyond imagination. This eastward expansion into what would become the Kievan Rus was particularly important. The rivers of Eastern Europe offered something unique: highways directly to wealth, furs from the vast northern forests, amber from Baltic coasts, access to trade networks that connected to Islamic markets where these goods commanded premium prices, access to trade flowing from the Islamic world back north. The Vikings who understood how to navigate these rivers and these trade networks could become fabulously wealthy. But the farther south these Vikings pushed, the more they left the waters where Viking naval advantage was decisive. They left the coast where ships could provide instant escape. They moved into territories where other powers had already developed their own military systems, their own responses to external threats, their own methods of maintaining territorial control. The Khazars represented the first serious obstacle, and they represented something that would force Vikings to fundamentally reconsider how they understood power, success, and expansion. The Khazar state, sophistication in the steppes. Before we can understand why the Khazars could do something no one else could, we need to understand who they actually were, because the Khazars weren't simply another steppe people struggling for survival. They were something different. They were a civilization that had learned to synthesize military tradition with governmental sophistication, that had figured out how to maintain power across vast territories without requiring ethnic or religious uniformity, that had created institutions that could coordinate complex operations across enormous distances. The Khazar state sprawled across territories north of the Caucasus. Their domain included the steppes, parts of what's now southern Russia, access to the Caspian Sea, and crucial river systems that serve as highways for trade and military movement. Geographically, they controlled some of the most important real estate in medieval Eurasia, the crossroads where trade from different regions met, where routes diverged, where whoever controlled the territory could extract enormous wealth simply by taxing commerce. Their capital, Ital, was situated in the Volga Delta. Imagine walking through the city in the 9th century. You'd encounter a cosmopolitan urban center that looked nothing like most medieval European cities. Walking through the markets, you'd hear dozens of languages. Scandinavian Viking merchants haggling over prices. Byzantine traders examining goods. Merchants from the Islamic Caliphate comparing notes on market trends. Slavic peoples from the north conducting business. Local populations who'd lived in the region for generations moving through the streets with purpose. The smell would be overwhelming. Spices from a dozen different markets mixed together, creating an aroma that would be almost intoxicating to travelers from the north. Incense from different religious practices wafting through neighborhoods. The sharp scent of leather and tar from ship repair workshops. The stench of working animals and crowded streets. The aroma of cooking food from dozens of different culinary traditions, each group maintaining their own style, their own preparation methods, their own relationship to food. The temples reflected this diversity. There would be places of Islamic worship where the faithful gathered for prayer. There would be Christian churches where believers sang and worshiped. There would be Jewish synagogues where scholars studied texts. There would be places where local peoples practiced their traditional religions, making offerings to gods and spirits that outsiders couldn't fully understand. And crucially, this wasn't forced coexistence. This was pragmatic tolerance driven by economic calculation and political sophistication. Different peoples practicing their own religions meant they stayed happy. Happy people were more likely to invest in the cities, to participate in commercial activities, to stay committed to the system rather than rebelling against it. At some point in their history, probably around the 8th century, something remarkable happened. The Khazar elite converted to Judaism. This wasn't because a Jewish military power conquered them. It wasn't because Jewish missionaries arrived with overwhelming arguments. It was a strategic choice made by Khazar leadership, and it reveals something important about how they thought about governance and power. Think about the geopolitical situation. Christianity was backed by the Byzantine Empire and was increasingly dominant in Europe. Islam was backed by the Caliphate and was expanding aggressively throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Judaism was backed by no major empire. By choosing Judaism, the Khazar leadership was making a statement. We are choosing a religion that aligns us with no regional power. We remain independent of the major religious blocs. We can trade with Christians without being seen as Christian. We can trade with Muslims without being seen as Muslim. This was sophisticated thinking. This was understanding that religious choice was a political choice, and that sometimes the smartest political choice was to not pick any of the obvious sides. The governmental structure reflected similar sophistication. The Khazar state wasn't ruled by a single absolute monarch in the way many medieval states operated. Instead, there was a dual leadership system. There was a king called the Khagan, who held supreme authority. But there was also a separate religious leader and a powerful bureaucratic apparatus that actually administered the state. Power was distributed. Major decisions went through consultation between these different centers of authority. This might sound inefficient compared to absolute monarchy, but it actually made the state more stable. An absolute monarch who made catastrophic decisions could trigger state collapse. A distributed power structure meant that no single person could destroy the entire system through poor judgment. It meant that different perspectives had to be heard before major policy decisions were made. It meant that the state had built-in mechanisms for checking the worst impulses of individual leaders. This was revolutionary thinking for the medieval world. Most political theorists wouldn't articulate these principles clearly for centuries, but the Khazars were practicing them. Learning through hard experience that concentrated power created instability, while distributed power created resilience. Economically, the Khazars had developed an approach that was different from traditional empires. They didn't try to be economically self-sufficient. They didn't attempt to produce vast quantities of goods for export. Instead, they positioned themselves as middlemen. Imagine silk and spices from China and the Islamic world flowing north toward Europe, Vikings and other northern peoples who had access to furs, and amber flowing south toward Islamic markets, goods flowing from the Byzantine Empire in different directions. All of these trade routes passed through territories the Khazars controlled. By maintaining control of these passages, by providing security for merchant caravans, by keeping the routes open and relatively stable, by taxing the trade that passed through, the Khazars became fabulously wealthy. You start learning to ride properly at around 16. You've handled horses for years, but riding in armor, riding while wielding weapons, riding while fighting, that's different. It's like learning to walk all over again. Your center of gravity is completely different in armor. Your balance is affected. Your range of motion is limited. The horse can sense your uncertainty. Medieval war horses are not the gentle creatures of fairy tales. They're bred for strength and power. They're temperamental. They don't like having a metal-covered human climb on their backs. They especially don't like the weight and the noise and the strange sensations. Training a horse for warfare is as much about breaking its spirit as it is about teaching it obedience. You observe this process. You watch horses that are beautiful and strong become subdued. You watch their resistance wear down through repetition and punishment. You watch them stop fighting and simply accept their fate. It's disturbing in ways you can't quite articulate, but this is necessary. A horse that won't tolerate armor, weapons, and combat isn't useful. When you finally mount a war horse yourself, even in controlled conditions with a trainer nearby, the fear is overwhelming. This animal is so large, so powerful, so capable of killing you with a single unexpected movement. You could fall and break your neck. The Byzantine Empire had them, but Byzantium was one of the oldest and wealthiest civilizations in the world. Most medieval European powers operated with feudal levies. Farmers called up for seasonal campaigns, lacking professional training, lacking discipline, lacking the kind of coordinated organization that comes from training together continuously. The Khazars had cracked the code. They had access to wealth. They had converted that wealth into professional military forces. And they had organized those forces into a system that would prove devastating to any opponent who tried to use traditional medieval tactics. The military machine, organization as weapon. Here's what most people get wrong about medieval warfare. They assume individual warrior skill was a primary factor in determining outcomes. Strength, courage, weapon mastery, ferocity, these things mattered, certainly. But they mattered far less than most people think when facing an opponent with a superior system. The Khazars understood something that most contemporary military forces hadn't fully grasped. Force multiplies when it's organized. Coordination defeats individual skill. Let's examine specifically how the Khazar military was organized, because understanding this is crucial to understanding how they defeated Viking tactics. You just know that sometimes they can be treated, and sometimes they can't. Thomas couldn't be, "You're aware now that you might die." Not eventually, in some distant abstract future. Actually die in the next 5 years, before you become a knight, before you ever see combat, from an infection or an accident or disease you pick up in a castle. This knowledge sits in the back of your mind. It's not paralyzing, because you're trained not to be paralyzed by things you can't control. But it's there, a constant low-level awareness that your life is fragile and that violence can end it at any moment. Let's talk about the armor. They carried long lances designed to pierce through formations and scatter coordinated defensive positions. They trained specifically for the role of breaking through enemy formations and creating chaos in organized defensive lines. They were the sword. They were used at specific moments to exploit weaknesses that other units had created. They were devastating in their specialized role, and they understood that their effectiveness came from acting in coordination with other units rather than from individual heroic action. A heavy cavalry charge was a precisely timed maneuver designed to hit at exactly the moment when enemy formations were most vulnerable and most disorganized. Light cavalry provided reconnaissance, harassment, and tactical flexibility. These warriors were lightly armored, leather instead of full plate. They could move quickly and maneuver rapidly. They carried bows and javelins. Their role was different from heavy cavalry. They weren't meant to break formations. They were meant to probe, to harass, to maintain contact with enemies, to disrupt opponent movements, to identify weak points for the heavy cavalry to exploit. They were the eyes and the secondary striking force, designed for harassment and intelligence gathering rather than decisive engagement. Light cavalry would engage an enemy, probe their formation to identify weaknesses, then withdraw, allowing heavy cavalry to attack at the weak points that had been identified. Infantry handled garrison duty, defended fortifications, held territory, and provided support when cavalry couldn't operate effectively in forests of terrain, for instance, where heavy cavalry lost much of its advantage. They also served as anchor points for cavalry tactics. The heavy cavalry would drive enemies toward infantry positions where the disorganization would be exploited. Infantry wasn't glamorous like cavalry, but it was essential. Without infantry holding territory and providing stable positions for cavalry to operate from, the cavalry would lack support and would be vulnerable to counterattack. But here's where it gets interesting: the coordination between these different units. Officers understood how different units worked together. When light cavalry attacked and drew an enemy force forward, heavy cavalry would be positioned to strike the flank. When an enemy tried to break through, infantry would hold territory, while cavalry disrupted the breakthrough attempt. Supply lines would keep all units fed even during extended campaigns across territories with no established towns or depots. Each unit had specific roles, but worked in concert with other units toward larger objectives. This required something Vikings had never needed to develop: obedience to hierarchy that transcended personal loyalty. A Viking warrior served a leader he knew personally, someone he'd chosen to follow based on reputation or family connection. That leader's charisma kept men fighting. If the leader fell, the loyalty sometimes fell with him. A war band was ultimately held together by personal relationships and personal reputation. A Khazar soldier served something more abstract. He served the system. He had officers he might barely know. He followed doctrine rather than just the voice of a single leader. If his officer fell, another officer took his place, and the unit continued operating according to established procedure. This wasn't new thinking. The Romans had operated this way centuries earlier, but it was rare in the medieval world, and it was absolutely foreign to Viking military culture. This difference in organizational philosophy had enormous practical implications when Vikings and Khazars encountered each other. The nightmare scenario: what actually happened? Let's walk through what this looked like in actual practice. Let's imagine a specific Viking warband encountering Khazar forces, because understanding the tactical reality is crucial to understanding why Vikings eventually stopped attempting conquest in Khazar territory. You're a Viking warband leader. Your name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that your experience, you're successful. You've led profitable raids across 3 countries. You've got roughly 100 skilled warriors. Every man is hardened. Most have killed before. All are equipped with weapons that'll cleave through bone if they connect. You've carried information about vulnerable settlements in Khazar territory. You've heard there's loot available. You've heard the Khazars are wealthy but not militarily focused. You've heard wrong, but you don't know that yet. You sail up a river into Khazar territory because rivers are highways, and highways lead to settlements, and settlements have things worth taking. The impact of riding horses for hours every day, combined with the weight of armor, damages your knee cartilage. Medieval knights had arthritis in their knees by their 40s, not mild arthritis. Severe arthritis that makes it painful to walk and nearly impossible to kneel. Your ankles and feet suffer similarly. The weight pulls everything down. The constant impact from walking and riding wears away cartilage. Bunions develop from the constant pressure. Your arches fall. By your 50s, walking more than a mile will cause significant pain. Your hips are stressed by years of riding horses. The motion of riding wears on the ball and socket joint. Medieval knights developed hip problems early. Bone spurs develop. The joint becomes inflamed. Again, by your 40s or 50s, walking and riding both become painful. But this is just from wearing the armor. This is before we even talk about actual combat injuries. Combat injuries in medieval times are different from what modern people imagine. Swords don't necessarily cut the way movies depict them. A sword blade is not infinitely sharp. Impact matters more than sharpness. A sword strike transfers force. If it doesn't cut all the way through the armor, the force still transfers to your body. The impact can break bones inside intact skin. It can cause internal bleeding. It can cause organs to fail from the trauma. And cuts do happen. Armor has weak points, the armpits behind the knees, the joints. You'll complete the raid and leave with whatever you can take. By midday, scouts report a military force approaching from the south. Cavalry, probably 100 strong, maybe more. You think, finally, an organized fight. These are real soldiers, not militia or frightened villagers. This will be challenging, but this is what we do. This is what we train for. You gather your warriors. You form them into a defensive position. Shield walls are raised. Weapons are ready. You've done this before. You'll do it again. You're confident. They never charge. Instead, they maintain distance. They circle your position. Arrows start falling. Your shields go up, but arrows find gaps. Men scream. You've lost maybe 10 warriors already, and you haven't seen the enemy's faces clearly. You've lost roughly 10% of your force, and no real combat has occurred. The arrows are effective. The positioning is professional. It's like nothing you've encountered. You try to advance. The cavalry retreats, maintaining distance. You slow down. They dart closer, probe your formation, attack weak points. A warrior beside you takes an arrow in the neck. Another loses his arm to a cavalry lance as they gallop past at controlled speed, like they're executing a choreographed maneuver. This is excruciating. You want to fight. You're trained to fight. You're built to fight. Fighting is the only thing you know how to do well. But there's nothing to fight. The Khazars won't let you close the distance. They won't engage in hand-to-hand combat. They won't allow you to use your strength and your skill. Your formation is breaking down, not from cowardice, but from the sheer frustration of being attacked from distance and not being able to respond effectively. Men are starting to look panicked, not from fear of death. Many Vikings died in wars, and that was accepted as the price of the lifestyle, but from confusion, from the wrongness of a situation where the tactics that should work aren't working. And then it gets worse. You try to withdraw toward your ships. The cavalry cuts you off. They've positioned themselves perfectly. They know the terrain better than you do. They've had scouts watching your movements. They're not trying to destroy you in a glorious final stand. They're just preventing your retreat. Some of your warriors panic now. Panic is weakness. Panic spreads. Your disciplined warband is becoming fractured. Your wounded are slowing down the retreat. You're losing men to cavalry harassment as you try to move. Supply is running low. Your ships feel impossibly far away. What started as a confidence-driven raid has become a desperate survival situation. You're not thinking about the glory of dying in battle anymore. You're thinking about whether you'll survive to see home again. Some warbands die in Khazar territory, completely wiped out. Others manage to fight their way back to their ships, but broken and traumatized. All of them end up with the same realization. Whatever we were expecting to encounter, this wasn't it. Whatever we were prepared for, our preparation was inadequate. And every warband that returns with this story makes the next warband less likely to attempt conquest. Stories spread. Word travels through Scandinavian ports and settlements. Tales of an enemy that fought differently. Tales of an enemy that couldn't be beaten using traditional tactics. Tales of an enemy that seemed to have the advantage of terrain, coordination, and professional military discipline all working together. Why traditional Viking tactics failed. To really understand why the Khazars proved so difficult to defeat, we need to examine specifically what made their military system effective against Viking approaches. The Viking military philosophy was built around several core principles. Shock and surprise. Vikings knew how to deliver violence quickly, before enemies could organize. They understood that the first few seconds of combat often determine outcomes. They'd built an entire military culture around delivering maximum aggression immediately. Concentration of force. They understood how to mass their fighters at a single point and overwhelm local defenses through concentrated violence. This approach required overcoming initial resistance, but once that was accomplished, Vikings typically had numerical and psychological advantage. Mobility. Ships provided escape routes. Horses provided speed. The ability to appear somewhere, strike, and disappear was fundamental to Viking success. They could operate across vast territories because they weren't bound to defending fixed positions. Psychological terror. The reputation of Vikings meant that many populations would surrender or panic before actual combat occurred. This reputation multiplied force effectiveness far beyond what pure numbers would suggest. These principles had worked everywhere Vikings had operated. They'd worked against coastal populations who had no experience with seaborne assault. They'd worked against interior populations who had no fortifications designed to resist raids. They'd worked against enemies who panicked when the violence started. The Khazars presented problems for every single one of these principles. Against shock and surprise, Khazar professional military discipline provided resistance. A standing army with regular training had practice responding to sudden attacks. Officers had procedures for responding to unexpected threats. The element of surprise was less effective when the opponent had anticipated it and prepared procedures for dealing with it. Against concentration of force, Khazar use of dispersed cavalry units meant that massing fighters at a single point didn't guarantee overwhelming the opponent. Heavy cavalry could strike at concentrated Viking groups from unexpected directions. Light cavalry could harass and disrupt formations before they fully cohered. Against mobility, the Khazars' deep knowledge of terrain meant that Vikings couldn't simply disappear with impunity. Khazar forces could move faster than Viking warbands burdened with plunder and equipment. More importantly, they could cut off retreat routes. Mobility is only effective if you have somewhere to retreat to. If a force blocks your escape, mobility becomes irrelevant. Against psychological terror, Khazar professional discipline meant that soldiers didn't panic at Viking aggression. They didn't flee. They didn't become disorganized. They maintained formations and executed doctrinal responses. To warriors accustomed to enemies breaking and scattering, facing an enemy that doesn't break is deeply unsettling. It was like Vikings had mastered warfare in one context and then encountered a context where all their assumptions about how warfare worked were invalidated. The system that breaks down raiding. Let's dig deeper into how Khazar military organization actually functioned, because understanding this is crucial to understanding how they were able to resist Viking expansion. The Khazars didn't operate like traditional steppe peoples. Traditional steppe nomads organized into loose confederations of tribes or clans. Leadership flowed from individual charismatic leaders. Loyalty was personal. Organization was informal. This approach worked well for certain types of warfare, particularly rapid raiding and mobile cavalry tactics. But it had weaknesses when trying to coordinate large forces across extended campaigns. The Khazars had learned from Byzantine and Persian military traditions. They'd incorporated elements of steppe cavalry tactics, but they'd added something crucial: governmental infrastructure that could sustain military operations. The Khazar state maintained elaborate supply systems. They had quartermaster organizations that tracked supplies. They had routes for delivering food and equipment to armies in the field. They had mechanisms for organizing these supplies across vast territories without established towns or depots. This was genuinely difficult to accomplish in the 9th century. Most medieval states struggled with supply. Armies typically either foraged from conquered territories or carried supplies that could feed them for limited periods. The Khazars had solved the supply problem for steppe warfare. They understood that armies could operate on the steppes for extended periods if the supply system was sophisticated enough. They had wagons. They had organized storage depots positioned strategically throughout their territory. They had procedures for rotating supplies. They had systems for tracking how much food was available and how much was being consumed. They understood that logistical capability was as important as tactical capability. This might sound tedious compared to stories of cavalry heroics, but it was the foundation for everything else. You can't maintain professional military forces if soldiers are starving. You can't conduct extended campaigns if your army supply runs out. Logistics is boring, but logistics is also the most important factor determining whether military power can actually be projected effectively. The Khazars also maintained intelligence networks. They had scouts. They had ways of knowing where threats were emerging before those threats arrived at their doors. This intelligence capability meant they could position forces effectively. When Vikings began moving up rivers into Khazar territory, the Khazars knew about it. They could gather forces in response. They could prepare for the encounter. This is different from reactive defense. Reactive defense means responding after an enemy has already struck. Active defense means knowing what's coming and being prepared to respond effectively. The Khazars seemed to practice active defense. They knew where Vikings were heading. They knew roughly how many warriors they had. They could position forces to intercept them before Vikings reached their primary targets. The fortification network also mattered tremendously. The Khazars maintained a network of fortifications spread throughout their territory. These weren't massive castles. They were strategic strongholds positioned at important locations: river crossings, mountain passes, major trade routes, territorial boundaries. This network served multiple purposes. It served as military outposts from which to launch operations. It served as supply bases for armies in the field. It served as refuges for populations during raids. It served as administrative centers for governing territory. By maintaining this network of fortifications, the Khazars ensured that even if they lost a particular battle or engagement, they maintained strategic depth. They could retreat to fortified positions. They could resupply. They could gather reinforcements. Vikings couldn't pursue indefinitely because they had no supply network. They couldn't assault fortifications effectively because their tactics were designed for rapid strikes, not for siege warfare. Siege warfare is slow, attrition-based, requires equipment and patience. Viking tactics were rapid, shock-based, required speed and mobility. These are nearly opposite approaches. A Khazar fortification network meant that Vikings who tried to press advantages into Khazar territory would eventually run into fortified positions they couldn't overcome. At that point, they had to either retreat or commit to a siege, and sieges were expensive in terms of casualties and time. Sieges meant more casualties than raids typically produced. Sieges meant extended campaigns instead of quick strikes. Sieges meant the possibility of relief forces arriving to drive the attackers off. All of this made raiding Khazar territory deeply unprofitable. The psychological component. Why fear matters. Here's something that often gets overlooked in military history. Psychological factors are real weapons, and they sometimes matter more than material factors. Vikings built their entire culture on the idea that courage and ferocity made them unstoppable. That belief had been reinforced countless times over decades. Towns fell, armies scattered, populations panicked. The reputation of Vikings had become self-reinforcing. People believed Vikings were unstoppable. So when Vikings attacked, people often surrendered immediately, which meant Vikings actually didn't face significant resistance. This created a psychological feedback loop. Expect to be unstoppable. Attack. Face minimal resistance because populations expect to be overrun. Win without significant casualties. This confirms a belief that you're unstoppable. Repeat. Then Vikings encountered Khazars, and this entire feedback loop broke down. Khazar forces didn't flee. They didn't panic. They didn't even seem particularly impressed by Viking aggression. They just coordinated a response that the Vikings couldn't counter. This was absolutely shocking to warriors accustomed to enemies breaking. Some Vikings began attributing the Khazars' effectiveness to factors outside the normal realm of warfare: magic, curses, sorcery. This wasn't stupidity. Vikings operated within a spiritual worldview where shamanic power and divine intervention were genuine categories. The Khazars had shamanic traditions that seemed genuinely alien to northern peoples. Khazar shamans used drums, chants, and trance rituals that looked deeply unsettling to outsiders. They entered altered states. They claimed knowledge of places no one else could reach. They seemed to possess power over terrain and weather that shouldn't be possible. From a Viking perspective, a perspective where the physical world was saturated with spirits and divine influence, this didn't seem irrational. It seemed like an accurate description of what was happening. The Khazars had power that transcended normal warfare. They had allies that Vikings didn't have. They operated according to rules that Vikings didn't understand. When an enemy seems to be achieving things that shouldn't be possible within your understanding of reality, fear becomes rational. You can't fight what you don't understand. You can't defeat an opponent who seems to have superhuman or supernatural advantages. Stories spread quickly. A Viking warband would return to Scandinavia with casualties they couldn't easily explain. Survivors would speak vaguely about impossible circumstances. The stories would grow in the retelling. The Khazars would develop reputations as sorcerers. Tales would circulate about warriors who vanished into forests and were never found. Tales about arrows that seemed to arrive from nowhere. Tales about cavalry that appeared and disappeared like spirits. Tales about the forest itself seeming to fight against invaders. These stories weren't entirely fabrication. They were exaggerations of real events filtered through a worldview where the supernatural was genuinely plausible. And whether the stories were perfectly accurate didn't matter. What mattered was that the stories achieved the same effect as if they were literally true. They made the Khazars seem more formidable, more mysterious, more impossible to overcome. The shift in strategy, pragmatism over pride. Here's where the story gets truly interesting. Sir Aldwin is alive. That's the first thing you check. He's alive and relatively unwounded. This is good. If he dies, you're responsible for keeping him alive, and you failed. Now comes the aftermath. The field is covered with bodies. Some are moving. Most aren't. The wounded are crying or moaning or trying to crawl. The dead are just still. There's a smell, blood, and sweat and shit, because people lose bowel control when they die. The soldiers who won are now engaged in looting the dead, stripping armor off bodies, taking weapons, taking anything valuable. This is their payment. They weren't paid to fight in this battle, and they probably won't be paid. But they can take what they find from enemy bodies. It's brutal but practical. They recognized that there was an alternative path to wealth and power in Eastern Europe that didn't require conquest of Khazar territory. This was pragmatism. This was recognizing that success meant something different than they'd initially thought. The Vikings didn't accept defeat and slink home. They didn't abandon Eastern Europe. Instead, they made a strategic calculation that changed the history of the region. Instead of trying to conquer them, why don't we integrate into Khazar trade networks? Why don't we become partners instead of conquerors? This sounds simple in retrospect, but it was revolutionary for a warrior culture built on conquest and domination. The trade opportunities in Eastern Europe were genuinely staggering. Some are from training. Some are from accidents. But the biggest threat to your life isn't combat. It's disease. You develop dysentery 3 years after that first major battle. It starts in the gut, pain, cramping. Then it progresses to severe diarrhea. You spend a lot of time in the latrine area feeling like you're dying. Your body is expelling everything, and you're becoming dangerously dehydrated. The camp physician, who is more herbalist than actual medical professional, tells you he needs to bleed you. This is the standard medical treatment for almost everything. Lay out some blood to balance your humors. You're not confident it will help, but you're desperate enough to try it. It doesn't help. It makes things worse. You lose blood on top of losing fluids through the diarrhea. Within a few days, you're so weak you can barely stand. You lose weight rapidly. Your skin hangs off your frame. You think about death casually. It seems like it might actually be coming. Then, over the course of a couple weeks, it slowly improves. Your body kills the dysentery through its own immune system. You recover, but you're not the same. Something about the dysentery damaged your digestive system. For months afterward, your stomach hurts constantly. Years later, you still have intermittent problems. You develop a respiratory infection that turns into pneumonia. Again, you're convinced you're dying. You're coughing up blood. You're burning with fever. The Vikings would focus on northern portions of trade networks. The Khazars would maintain control of southern portions. They would cooperate on major trade flows. They would avoid direct military conflict. Both sides prospered through this arrangement. The transformation of Viking settlements. Understanding what happened to Vikings after they stopped attempting conquest is crucial to understanding the broader historical impact of their encounter with Khazars. Vikings who had initially sailed into Eastern Europe as raiders gradually transformed into settlers. Settlements that started as military strongholds, fortified positions from which to control territory, began to develop urban characteristics. They accumulated permanent populations. They developed trade infrastructure. They became actual cities instead of just military outposts. Kiev is the most famous example, but the pattern applied across Eastern Europe. A Viking settlement might start as a fortified position controlling a river crossing. But over time, as trade became more important than raiding, the settlement's character changed. More people stayed permanently. Families settled. Slavic populations began living alongside Viking elites. Mixed marriages occurred. Children grew up speaking multiple languages and understanding multiple cultural contexts. This integration didn't happen without tension. Incorporating Slavic populations into Viking-led polities required negotiating complex relationships. It required Slavic acceptance of Viking authority and Viking willingness to govern in ways that were somewhat acceptable to Slavic peoples. It required establishing legal systems that both Vikings and Slavs could operate under. It required managing religious differences between Viking paganism, Slavic paganism, and Christianity, which was spreading in the region. These processes took centuries and involved complex negotiations and sometimes genuine conflict. But gradually, a new civilization began to emerge from the mixture of Viking settlers, Slavic populations, and influences from neighboring powers. The Khazars played an interesting, if indirect, role in this process. While the Khazars weren't directly governing the territories where Vikings were establishing themselves, Khazar governmental and military organization provided models that Vikings and their successors could learn from and adapt. The Khazars had demonstrated that sophisticated governance was possible. They demonstrated that managing multicultural populations was achievable. They demonstrated that military effectiveness flowed from organizational sophistication, not just individual warrior prowess. They demonstrated that trade networks could be more profitable than conquest. These lessons were absorbed by Vikings and their descendants. As the Kievan Rus developed from Viking settlements in Russia, it incorporated many elements of Khazar organization. The way the Kievan Rus organized its military forces showed steppe cavalry influences, probably partially learned directly, but also partially learned through mediation of Khazar models. The way the Kievan Rus maintained fortification networks, organized supply systems, and created professional military structures all showed influences from more sophisticated military traditions than Vikings alone would have brought. The broader context, steppe military traditions. To fully understand why the Khazars were able to do something no one else could, we need to understand the broader context of steppe military traditions. The steppes of Central Asia and Eastern Europe had always produced distinctive warrior cultures. The Scythians were steppe warriors. The Sarmatians were steppe warriors. The Huns were steppe warriors. The Mongols, centuries later, would be steppe warriors who would transform world history. There was something about the environment that produced particular military innovations and particular military philosophies. Open, vast territories meant that cavalry developed differently than in forested or mountainous regions. In open terrain, cavalry could maneuver effectively and strike from unexpected directions. In open terrain, archery from horseback was devastating. The archer had distance and mobility that infantry couldn't match. In open terrain, the logistics of an army changed. Traditional supply lines that worked in settled territories didn't work across empty steppes. Armies had to become more self-sufficient and better at living off the land. Over centuries, steppe peoples had developed military traditions suited to these conditions. They developed light cavalry tactics that emphasized mobility and archery. They developed approaches to logistics that didn't rely on established depots. They developed methods of moving rapidly across vast territories without losing cohesion. They developed coordinated cavalry tactics where different units worked together to surround and destroy opponents. The trauma and the passage of time have blurred events together. You remember major battles, but smaller skirmishes blur together. You remember killing people, but the faces are often generic. You can't remember their specific features. You have nightmares. Not constant nightmares, but frequent ones. You wake up sometimes covered in sweat, your heart pounding, having just relived some combat scenario. You've been doing this for over a decade, and it hasn't gotten better. You're drinking regularly now. Not constantly drunk, but you drink every evening. Wine mostly, sometimes stronger spirits. You drink to help you sleep. You drink to make the pain bearable. You drink to make the memories less vivid. This is normal. Almost every night drinks regularly. The alcohol helps everyone cope. By the time you're 35, your Lord has granted you land. It's not huge, a few villages, some farmland, maybe 100 families who owe you service. It's enough to be respectable. It's enough to get you married. The marriage is arranged. Your bride is a daughter of another knight, a political alliance that makes sense to both families. She's 17. You're 35. The age difference is normal for the time, but it means you're a stranger to her and she's terrified of you. You try to be gentle on the wedding night, but you're not really equipped for tenderness. You've spent decades training to be a weapon. Gentleness doesn't come naturally. The marriage is consummated, but not particularly successful. She cries quietly afterward. You pretend not to notice. Your wife's name is Eleanor. She's intelligent. She has opinions. Over months and years, you grow to genuinely like her, even if love is too strong a word. She manages your estate while you're away. She writes you letters. Some of them make you emotional, though you'd never admit that to anyone. She gets pregnant. You're at war, and you get word that you have a daughter. You've never met her. By the time the war ends and you return home, she's 3 months old. She looks nothing like you thought. She's tiny and fragile, and completely dependent on others for survival. You don't know how to interact with her. Your hands are scarred and rough. You're a killer. This child is vulnerable. These things don't go together. Eleanor teaches you how to hold her properly. She tells you about the pregnancy and the birth, which sounds horrifying. Blood and pain and the constant fear that something would go wrong. You listen to her describe it and you feel grateful you didn't have to experience it, which is absurd because pregnancy and childbirth is actually dangerous and women die from it relatively frequently. You spend a few months with your family, but then there's a call to arms again. More warfare somewhere. Your Lord needs you. You have to leave. Eleanor doesn't say anything, but you see the disappointment in her face. She's managing the estate alone. She's raising a child alone. And now you're leaving again. The separation becomes normal. Years pass in a pattern. You're home for a few months. Then you're away for months or sometimes a year at a time. Your daughter grows up barely knowing you. By the time you see her again, she's changed. She's walking when you last saw her, and now she can talk. She's learned things you didn't teach her. She has memories of you that you can't remember making because you weren't there. You have a son eventually. You're home for his birth. You actually get to experience some of his infancy. But then, when he's 2, another war starts and you're gone for 2 years. You come back, and he barely recognizes you. He's afraid of this large, scary man in armor. Silk from China and Central Asia. Spices from the Islamic world and beyond. Goods from Byzantium and Mediterranean regions. Furs from northern forests. Amber from Baltic coasts. Walrus ivory and other luxury goods from the far north. Each of these goods represented wealth and represented connections between distant regions. Merchants who operated across these networks became cosmopolitan figures. They had to understand multiple languages. They had to respect multiple religious traditions. They had to navigate different legal systems. They had to understand what different markets valued and how to facilitate exchanges between markets with different supply and demand characteristics. Vikings who engaged in trade absorbed cultural influences from the peoples they traded with. They learned languages. They learned commercial practices. They learned how to present themselves in different contexts. They learned how to cooperate with people from dramatically different backgrounds. This wasn't cultural obliteration. Vikings maintained many aspects of their identity, but they also became something more than purely Viking. The connections created through trade networks meant that ideas, technologies, and cultural practices spread as well as goods. Military technologies flowed from sophisticated cultures to less sophisticated cultures. Religious ideas spread. Artistic traditions influenced each other. Technological innovations were transmitted across distances. This process of cultural exchange through trade networks was one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of medieval history. Part 2. The Khazar civilization fully realized. Now that we understand how the Khazars functioned militarily and economically, let's examine the civilization itself in more depth, because the Khazars were more than just a military force or an economic network. They were a sophisticated civilization with complex institutions, cultural achievements, and approaches to governance that were genuinely innovative for the ninth century. Governmental organization, balance of powers. The Khazar governmental structure was fundamentally different from most medieval states. This difference reflected sophisticated political thinking about how to structure governance to prevent the excesses and failures that afflicted other states. The dual leadership system, a supreme king Khagan, paired with a separate religious authority and a powerful bureaucratic apparatus, created a system where power was genuinely distributed. This wasn't a system where theoretical limits on monarchy existed, but could be easily overridden. This was a system where different centers of power had genuine authority and could actually resist each other. The Khagan made major decisions regarding war, foreign policy, and overall state direction. But the religious authority had influence over domestic policies, affecting religious practice and cultural matters. The bureaucratic apparatus administered the actual functioning of government, tax collection, justice, infrastructure maintenance, and 1,000 details that governments handled daily. This distribution of power meant that no single person could unilaterally destroy the state. An incompetent Khagan could make poor decisions, but the religious authority and the bureaucratic apparatus could constrain damage. The system had built-in redundancy. If one center of power failed, others could continue functioning. The administrative structure reflected this. The Khazars had organized their state into provinces. Each province had a governor appointed by the central authority. But governors had enough autonomy to adapt policies to local conditions while still being accountable to central authority. This allowed the Khazars to govern vast territories with diverse populations without requiring direct central control of every decision. Tax systems reflected this sophisticated understanding of governance. The Khazars levied taxes on trade passing through their territory, but they also levied taxes on land and on goods produced within their domain. The tax system was designed to extract wealth without being so burdensome that it created rebellion. This balance was crucial. Tax systems that were too harsh would trigger uprising. Tax systems that were too lenient wouldn't provide sufficient revenue for governmental functions. Religious tolerance, pragmatism over uniformity. The religious policies of the Khazars represented a genuinely different approach to a problem that had plagued medieval states for centuries. Most medieval states believed that religious uniformity was necessary for political stability. If everyone believed the same thing, the logic went, then everyone would have aligned loyalties and wouldn't rebel against the government. Religious minorities were often persecuted, forced to convert, or expelled. Religious uniformity was seen as the foundation of political unity. The Khazars rejected this logic entirely. Instead, they practiced religious tolerance, not out of liberal principles in the modern sense, but out of pragmatic calculation that religious diversity was manageable and that attempting religious uniformity would create more problems than it solved. They understood something that wouldn't be widely recognized until centuries later, that forced conversions and religious persecution often created more instability than tolerance did. Different populations within the Khazar domain practiced different religions. The Khazar elite had adopted Judaism, but significant populations practiced Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and various pagan traditions. Rather than try and force everyone to convert to Judaism, the Khazars allowed different groups to practice their own religions. This wasn't merely tolerant in a modern sense. It was strategically brilliant. This approach had profound practical advantages. First, it meant that religious minorities didn't have motivation to rebel. They weren't being persecuted. They weren't being forced to abandon their faiths. They could practice their religions openly. This meant they had reason to be loyal to the state that allowed them this freedom. Second, it allowed the Khazars to attract merchants and skilled people from diverse backgrounds. A Christian merchant could conduct business in Khazar territory without feeling like he was in a hostile environment. A Muslim scholar could establish himself in the Khazar city without fear of persecution. This diversity of peoples brought skills, knowledge, and commercial networks that enriched Khazar civilization. Third, it allowed the Khazars to maintain diplomatic relationships with multiple neighboring powers without creating religious conflicts. They could trade with Christian Byzantium while also maintaining relationships with Islamic powers. They could negotiate with Jewish communities elsewhere without appearing to be puppets of Jewish interests. This religious independence gave them diplomatic flexibility that religiously uniform states lacked. The multicultural nature of Khazar civilization. The Khazar state was genuinely multicultural in ways that most medieval states were not. Different ethnic groups lived within Khazar territories. Turkic peoples who formed the core of the Khazar state coexisted with Slavic populations, Armenian populations, and various other groups. Different linguistic traditions persisted. People in different regions spoke different languages. Trade required multilingualism anyway. Merchants who couldn't speak multiple languages couldn't operate effectively on Khazar trade routes. This multiculturalism meant that Khazar civilization had access to diverse forms of knowledge and diverse approaches to problems. Military tactics could be borrowed from multiple traditions. Architectural styles could be synthesized from different sources. Governmental practices could incorporate the best ideas from multiple political traditions. Artistic and cultural traditions could blend and create something new. Cultural sophistication and urban life. One of the most misleading aspects of how the Khazars are portrayed is a tendency to view them purely as a military or economic force, without recognizing their cultural sophistication. The Khazars produced art, literature, and architecture. They developed distinctive styles that reflected influences from multiple cultural traditions. They maintained libraries. They supported scholars. They patronized artisans. They understood that a civilization is more than just military power and economic organization. The capital, Ital, was not just a military fortress or a trading post. It was a genuine city with urban complexity. It had markets where merchants from dozens of different origins bought and sold goods from across the known world. It had residential areas where different communities maintained their own neighborhoods. It had administrative buildings where the business of state was conducted. It had religious structures for different faiths standing near each other in relative harmony. It had entertainment venues, theaters, bathhouses, places where people gather for social interaction. It had the culture and complexity of an actual urban center, not just a military outpost. This mattered for several reasons. First, it meant that the Khazars could attract talent. Scholars, artisans, merchants, and adventurers could find opportunities in Khazar cities. If you were an ambitious merchant, you wanted to be where the money was, and the money was in Khazar cities. If you were a scholar, you wanted to be where learning was valued and supported. Second, it meant that Khazar civilization had cultural legitimacy beyond what pure military or economic power alone would provide. The Khazars were wealthy, certainly. The Khazars were militarily formidable, certainly. But they were also cultivated. They supported learning. They produced art. This cultural dimension added to their prestige and influence in ways that wealth and military power alone couldn't achieve. Third, it meant that cities like Ital could serve as cultural exchange centers. Different peoples encountered each other in markets and public spaces. Ideas spread. Technologies were transmitted. Religious practices were compared and sometimes adopted. The Khazar cities were centers of cultural ferment where multiple traditions encountered each other and sometimes synthesized into something new. The decline of Khazar power. The Khazars eventually declined as a major power. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't a catastrophic military defeat triggered by a single catastrophic engagement. Rather, it was a gradual erosion of power as circumstances shifted in ways that were partially outside the Khazar ability to control. By the 11th century, roughly 200 years after the Vikings had stopped attempting to conquer Khazar territory, Khazar power was significantly diminished. The state would persist for some additional time, persisting in diminished form for another century or more, but would no longer be a major regional power. The civilization that had once dominated Eastern Europe and commanded respect from Vikings and Byzantines alike had faded into obscurity. What caused this decline? Multiple factors, none catastrophic individually, but collectively transformative. Understanding the decline is as important as understanding the period of greatness, because it reveals something crucial about power. Even sophisticated states with effective institutions cannot indefinitely resist the currents of broader historical change. The rise of the Kievan Rus represented the emergence of a successor power that would eventually dominate the same territories and trade networks that the Khazars had controlled. The Kievan Rus emerged from Viking settlements in Russia, particularly from the settlements that Vikings had established in cooperation with Khazar-controlled trade networks. But as the Kievan Rus expanded and consolidated power, it came into conflict with Khazar interests. This wasn't usually sudden military confrontation. It was gradual expansion, incremental territorial absorption, and gradual shift of power from Khazar hands to Kievan Rus hands. As the Kievan Rus extended its influence southward and eastward, Khazar influence correspondingly retreated. Not the hero on horseback in shining armor, the man in pain, covered in scars, psychologically damaged, far from home, dealing with a body that was breaking down faster than it should have. The man who was trained to ignore suffering and then had to live with the consequences of that training for decades. If you were transported back to medieval times and became a knight, this is what you would experience. Not glory, not honor, pain and suffering and loss and slowly accumulating damage until the day you died. That's the reality that no one sells you. That's the story that nobody tells in songs. That is what it actually sucked to be a medieval knight. The particular routes that the Khazars had dominated, the great river routes flowing through their territory, were becoming less crucial to international commerce. A state whose wealth derived primarily from controlling specific trade routes finds itself increasingly impoverished if those routes become less important. The Khazars had built their entire economic and political system on the basis of being the middlemen for certain key trade routes. When those routes became less important, or when alternative routes became available, the foundation of Khazar power began to crumble. It's worth noting that the Khazars did attempt to adapt to changing circumstances. They tried to maintain their position through diplomacy and through continued military strength. But sometimes adaptation simply isn't sufficient when broader circumstances have changed fundamentally. Changing geopolitical conditions in the Islamic world also affected Khazar prosperity. By the 11th century, the patterns of Islamic expansion had stabilized. The rapid conquests and territorial expansions of earlier centuries had slowed. The nature of Islamic power in the Mediterranean and Middle East had evolved. Different Islamic powers rose and fell, and as they did, the pattern of Islamic trade with northern territories changed. Routes shifted, trade patterns adjusted. Again, the Khazars found themselves in an economically diminished position relative to their previous status. The Mongol invasions that would eventually sweep through the region in the 13th century would destabilize the entire region and definitively end Khazar power. But by the time the Mongols arrived, the Khazars were already fading. The Mongols would finish what broader historical processes had already started. They would conquer territories that the Khazars had once dominated, but the Khazars would not be major powers resisting the Mongol advance. They would be a minor player swept aside. Why? Power proves ephemeral. The Khazar decline reveals something important about the nature of power and the limits of sophistication. Even excellent organizations and sophisticated institutions cannot indefinitely overcome the currents of historical change. Military excellence is important, but it's not the only factor determining whether a state survives and thrives long term. Economic conditions matter. Geopolitical circumstances matter. The rise or fall of neighboring powers matters. The shift of trade patterns matters. The shift of technologies that make certain routes more or less important matters. The overall direction of historical forces matters. A state can be militarily excellent and still find itself declining because broader circumstances have shifted beyond its control. The Khazars had maintained military effectiveness. They had maintained sophisticated governance. They had maintained economic vitality. But broader circumstances shifted, and particular advantages they'd enjoyed gradually became less relevant. This is an important historical lesson. It reminds us that power is always provisional and always subject to change. No civilization, no matter how sophisticated, is guaranteed perpetual dominance. The Khazars are not unique in this respect. You'd watch them die in agony, and then you'd get sick. You'd feel the sickness coming. You'd know you were going to die. You'd be terrified. And during the plague, society would break down. People would flee cities. Families would abandon sick relatives. Priests would refuse to administer last rites. Society would collapse. You'd be alone with your sickness. You'd die alone. Nobody would be there to comfort you. Let's talk about pollution and environmental degradation. Medieval environments were polluted. Air was polluted from fires and animal waste. Water was polluted from human waste and animal waste. Soil was degraded from overuse. The environment was toxic, and people had no understanding of pollution. Their military reputation has persisted for over 1,000 years, and deservedly so. They were formidable warriors who conquered and settled across enormous distances. They demonstrated innovation in military technology and tactics. They showed capacity for long-distance navigation and exploration. They created political and military structures that allowed them to maintain influence across vast territories. But they were not invincible. The Khazar story reminds us of this fundamental truth. The Vikings were pragmatic warriors capable of recognizing when military conquest wasn't working and finding alternative paths to power and wealth. And this pragmatism, this willingness to adapt when confronted with limits, is actually a sign of wisdom, not weakness. The lesson isn't that Vikings were weak. The lesson is that military dominance is never permanent, and pragmatism beats rigidity. Throughout history, we see this pattern repeated. Civilizations that maintain military strength indefinitely seem impossible. But what actually persists is a capacity to recognize when military dominance is being challenged and to adapt strategies accordingly. The Vikings who recognized that cooperation with Khazars could be more profitable than conquest became fabulously wealthy. She might become a nun because that was the only socially acceptable alternative to marriage. The groom's family would also bring property into the marriage, usually land or money or the promise of inheritance. This would become the joint property of the married couple, though it would be controlled by the husband. A wife didn't control property. Anything she brought became her husband's. Anything she earned became her husband's. She had no legal identity separate from her husband. She was a dependent, like a child, like a servant. She owed obedience to her husband. He could legally hit her. He could legally confine her. He could legally force her to have sex with him. The power of organization. Throughout history, we see examples of smaller forces defeating larger forces, and less numerous peoples maintaining power against more numerous peoples. The common thread in these stories is usually superior organization. This principle emerged from the Vikings-Khazars interaction, and it has appeared repeatedly throughout history. The Khazars were probably never more numerous than the Byzantines. They never had as many resources as the Islamic Caliphate. They never commanded territories as vast as some other powers. But through military sophistication and governmental organization, they punched above their weight and maintained power and influence far beyond what their raw size and resources might suggest. This organizational sophistication multiplied their power effectiveness beyond what raw resources would suggest. A Khazar cavalry force organized into coordinated units with clear roles and responsibilities could defeat a larger Viking raiding force because the Vikings lacked this organizational sophistication. Understanding this principle helps explain many historical patterns that might otherwise seem mysterious. Smaller empires sometimes dominate larger ones. Less numerous populations sometimes maintain independence against more numerous ones. The factor that usually determines the outcome is organizational sophistication, the ability to coordinate complex operations, maintain supply and communication, adapt tactics based on intelligence, and coordinate different units toward common objectives. This lesson applies far beyond the medieval world. In modern military affairs, organizational sophistication matters as much or more than raw military capability. In business, organizational sophistication often determines success or failure more than raw financial resources. In any domain involving coordinated group action, the ability to organize effectively often determines outcomes more than the raw resources available to the group. She couldn't remarry. She was stuck. For men, adultery was a different situation. Men could have mistresses. Men could have illegitimate children. This was considered wrong, but it was tolerated. A man of means might have a wife at home and a mistress elsewhere. His wife had to accept this or live with constant humiliation. A woman who committed adultery, by contrast, was committing a serious crime. She was betraying her husband. She was putting the paternity of heirs in doubt. She could be killed by her husband legally. The consequences for a woman's adultery were severe. The consequences for a man's adultery were minimal. Pregnancy was dangerous for women. You'd never be able to express yourself freely. You'd be constantly pretending to be someone you weren't. You'd be living a lie. This would destroy your sense of self. Let's talk about the role of alcohol as self-medication. We've touched on this, but it's worth expanding on. Medieval people drank a lot because alcohol was safer than water. But alcohol was also used for self-medication. People drank to escape the misery. People drank to forget. People drank to numb the pain. And alcoholism would be rampant. People would be constantly drinking. They'd be slightly intoxicated most of the time. This would affect behavior. This would affect judgment. This would affect relationships. But nobody would consider a problem. It would be normal. Sex was for procreation. A husband's responsibility was to impregnate his wife so she could bear heirs. How the wife experienced this was irrelevant. A woman was expected to endure sex, to submit to it, not to enjoy it. The idea that a woman might want sex, that she might have desires, that she might seek pleasure was seen as immoral. A virtuous woman didn't want sex. She endured it as a duty. A woman who seemed to want sex was sexually suspect. She was potentially unfaithful. She was potentially a temptress or a seductress. Some medieval marriages were happy. Some husbands loved their wives. Some women loved their husbands. Some couples found companionship and affection with each other. You'd respond to conflict with violence yourself, and the violence would create trauma. Even if you weren't directly harmed, witnessing violence would traumatize you. You'd see people getting hurt. You'd see people fighting. You'd see the consequences of violence. And this would damage you psychologically. Let's talk about the role of faith as the only source of comfort. Medieval people clung to faith. Faith was the only thing that made sense of suffering. If your child died, faith told you they were in heaven. If you were suffering, faith told you it had meaning. If your life was terrible, faith told you that you'd be rewarded in the afterlife. And this faith would be the only thing keeping you sane. Without faith, life would be completely meaningless. You'd be working and suffering with no purpose. But faith would give you purpose. Faith would give you hope. Faith would give you meaning. But this faith would also be manipulative. The church would use faith to control you. The church would tell you to accept your suffering. The church would tell you not to question your conditions. The church would tell you to be obedient and submissive. Faith would be a tool of control. Let's talk about the role of community and belonging. Medieval life would be organized around community. You'd live in a village. You'd know everyone. You'd have a sense of belonging. This would be the only positive aspect of medieval life. But the basic model that the Khazars had demonstrated, that empire can encompass diverse peoples and religions while maintaining political unity, persisted and influenced Russian political culture for centuries. The lesson here applies to modern contexts. Societies that can accommodate diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, cultural diversity, tend to be more stable and more dynamic than societies built on rigid uniformity. Diverse societies have access to more forms of knowledge, more approaches to solving problems, more perspectives on how to address challenges. This diversity of perspective can be a source of innovation and strength. The importance of trade, the economic dimensions of the Viking-Khazar interaction were ultimately more important than the military dimensions. Military power created the conditions under which economic relationships developed, but the lasting consequences came from the trade networks that emerged. This is often overlooked in narratives focused on military history. We focus on battles and warriors and conquests, but the real drivers of historical change are often economic. Trade networks create connections between distant peoples. Trade networks spread technologies and ideas. Trade networks create wealth. Trade networks create incentives for peace, since commerce is interrupted by conflict. The Vikings and Khazars demonstrate this principle perfectly. After initial military conflicts, both groups recognized that trade was more profitable than continued warfare. This recognition drove them toward cooperation. The trade networks that emerged enriched both sides and created lasting connections between them. The goods flowing through these networks represented extraordinary wealth and represented connections between regions separated by thousands of miles. A single shipment of high-quality furs could generate wealth that would take years of military raiding to accumulate. This economic incentive was more powerful than military pride or cultural superiority. Understanding the importance of trade helps explain many historical patterns. The age of exploration was driven as much by trade opportunities as by territorial conquest. The Industrial Revolution was driven by trade and commerce. Modern globalization is driven by trade networks. The world's most prosperous regions are often those with access to extensive trade networks. Contingency and the role of chance in history. The Khazar story also tells us something important about contingency. The idea that history could have gone differently, that small changes in initial conditions could have led to very different outcomes. The Vikings expanded into Eastern Europe, and they encountered the Khazars, and they recognized that the Khazars were too militarily formidable to conquer directly. But if instead they had encountered a less organized military force, if instead they had encountered peoples without professional military structures and sophisticated tactics, they might have conquered this territory and established a Norse kingdom there. The entire history of Eastern Europe would have developed differently because they encountered the Khazars, because the Khazars had developed sophisticated military organization. The outcome was different. History pivoted on this military confrontation. This contingency extends to broader patterns as well. The Kievan Rus developed from Viking settlements in Russia, but the Kievan Rus also incorporated elements of Khazar governmental organization and culture. If Vikings had conquered Khazar territory directly, if they had replaced Khazar institutions with purely Viking institutions, the Kievan Rus would have developed very differently. The Russian civilization that would eventually emerge would have different characteristics. If the Khazars had been more hostile to all Viking presence, if they had insisted on complete expulsion rather than integration, the development of the trade networks that enriched both sides might not have occurred. The Vikings might have explored other routes. The trade patterns that connected northern forests to Islamic markets would have developed differently. The economic incentives that drew Vikings to settle permanently in Eastern Europe would have been different. Understanding this contingency is important because it reminds us that history is not inevitable. The rise of European Christian civilization and later European dominance was not inevitable. The specific forms that Russian civilization took were not inevitable. The particular characteristics of the societies that emerged from Viking settlements were not inevitable. All of these things were shaped by countless smaller decisions and interactions, including interactions between Vikings and Khazars that most people don't know about. This recognition of contingency should make us humble about historical prediction. We cannot know with certainty what will happen based on current circumstances. Small changes in initial conditions can cascade into enormous historical differences. The world we live in is a result of countless interactions and decisions, many of which seemed insignificant at the time, but which accumulated into the historical reality we inhabit. Conclusion: a story that deserves to be remembered. In conclusion, the story of Vikings and Khazars is a story about how medieval history actually worked. It is a story about military innovation and how it creates advantage. It is a story about how larger or more aggressive powers can be resisted by smaller powers with superior organization and tactics. It is a story about how pragmatism and adaptation can be more effective than rigid adherence to established approaches. It is a story about how multiple forms of power, not just military power, interact to shape historical outcomes. Military power is important, but so is economic power, political power, cultural influence, and organizational sophistication. The Khazars exercised all of these forms of power simultaneously. The Vikings, similarly, exercised multiple forms of power. The success of both depended on effectively combining these different forms of power and knowing when to emphasize one form over another. It is a story about how civilizations can exercise enormous influence even if they eventually cease to exist as independent political entities. The Khazars disappeared as a state, but their influence persisted in the successor civilizations that emerged from their territory. Khazar governmental models influenced the Kievan Rus. Khazar military traditions influenced later warrior cultures. Khazar trade networks influenced economic patterns for centuries. The Khazars may have disappeared as a distinct political entity, but their influence persisted long after their political power had waned. It is a story about the importance of understanding that history was not inevitable, that different choices could have led to different outcomes, that historical contingency is real, Understanding this contingency helps us recognize that the world we live in is not predetermined, and that different choices by different actors can lead to very different results. It is a story that has been largely forgotten by popular history, but that deserves to be remembered because it teaches important lessons about medieval history, about military power, about civilization, and about how history actually works. The Vikings who encountered the Khazars were not defeated in a catastrophic military loss. They were not conquered by a superior power. Modern people have rights. Medieval people had almost no rights. Modern people have protection. Medieval people had no protection. Let's talk about the parts of medieval life that weren't terrible. There were some good things. Community was important. People had a sense of belonging. People had connection to others. People had shared values and beliefs. This sense of community provided support and meaning. Modern people often lack this. We're isolated. We're individualistic. We don't have strong community ties. Medieval people had this. Even if the community was also oppressive, there was also a certain simplicity to medieval life that was appealing in some ways. Life was organized around basic needs. You worked. You ate. You slept. The Khazars, for their part, created a civilization that maintained power and influence for centuries through military sophistication, governmental excellence, and economic prowess. When they eventually declined, it was not because they had been conquered militarily by the Vikings or by any other power. It was because broader circumstances gradually shifted. New powers emerged. Trade patterns changed. The particular advantages that the Khazars had enjoyed gradually diminished, but the influence that the Khazars had exercised persisted. The military traditions that they had developed influenced later warrior cultures. The governmental models that they had pioneered influenced later states. The trade networks that they had maintained influenced economic patterns for centuries. The Khazars may have disappeared as a distinct political entity, but their influence persisted long after their political power had waned. This is the story of Vikings and Khazars, a story of two different civilizations encountering each other and adapting to the encounter. A story of military innovation and how it shapes historical outcomes. A story of pragmatism and how it could be more effective than rigid adherence to established approaches. We need to understand what the past was actually like. We need to understand the suffering. We need to understand the horror. Because if we don't, we might actually try to recreate the past. We might actually try to go backwards. And that would be a disaster. Let's talk about specific aspects of medieval daily life that we haven't fully explored yet. Let's talk about what you would eat. Medieval food was terrible. If you were a peasant, you'd eat bread. You'd eat a lot of bread. Bread was a staple of the medieval diet. You'd get maybe a pound or two of bread per day. You'd eat it with water or weak beer. That was a meal. Sometimes you'd have vegetables, peas, beans, turnips, root vegetables. These would be boiled or added to soup. Part of the reason is simple. The Khazar state eventually declined and disappeared. Surviving civilizations tend to get more attention from historians than extinct civilizations. Egyptian history is well known because Egypt has maintained continuity to the present day. Greek history is well known because Greece has maintained cultural continuity. The Khazars disappeared, so people don't learn about them in school. But there's probably more to it than that. The Khazars were a multicultural, multi-religious state led partly by rulers who had adopted Judaism. They were not Christians, and they were not Muslims at a time when Christianity and Islam were becoming increasingly dominant in the region. Nutrition didn't matter much. Just calories. Just enough to keep working. The food would be bland. It would be monotonous. You'd be sick of it, but you'd eat it anyway because you had no choice. Let's talk about what you would wear. Your clothes would be uncomfortable. They'd be made of rough materials. Linen or wool. They'd be scratchy. They'd irritate your skin. They'd be heavy. In summer, they'd be too hot. In winter, they wouldn't be warm enough. You'd be uncomfortable in your clothes constantly. And you'd wear the same clothes day after day. You wouldn't have many clothes. You'd have maybe one or two sets of clothes. You'd wear them constantly. They'd get dirty. You wouldn't change them. They'd smell. They'd be infested with parasites. Byzantine historians mention Khazars. Islamic geographers describe Khazar territories and customs. Russian chronicles contain references to Khazars, but the Khazars themselves left less direct testimony about their own history and their own perspective on events. This raises an important historiographical point that extends beyond just the Khazars. History is written by people with access to means of writing and with motivation to preserve written records. People with religious institutions that valued record keeping tend to leave more records. People with literate governmental bureaucracies tend to leave more records. There would be festivals and holidays where you'd get a break from work. You'd celebrate. You'd drink. You'd dance. But these would be rare, maybe a few times a year. The rest of the time, there would be no entertainment, and you'd be bored constantly. You'd be doing repetitive work all day. Your mind would be numbed by the monotony. You'd want stimulation. You'd want something interesting to happen. But nothing interesting would happen. Every day would be the same as the last. You'd be bored and depressed and trapped. Let's talk about what you would do at night. When darkness fell, you'd be in your home. It would be dark unless you had a candle or a fire. Most likely you wouldn't have a candle because candles were expensive. The nature of the historical record is such that literate civilizations with strong record-keeping traditions tend to dominate the historical narratives that survive. Understanding the Khazars requires reading between the lines of what outsiders wrote about them. It requires understanding their archaeological record, which includes fortifications, settlements, and artifacts that reveal information about their material culture and their way of life. It requires understanding the context of their interactions with other civilizations and try to infer what their motivations and strategic thinking must have been based on their actions. It requires recognizing that absence of detailed written records does not mean absence of sophistication or absence of historical importance. The Khazars deserve to be remembered despite this bias in the historical record. Their story teaches important lessons. Understanding them helps us understand medieval history more fully. Understanding them helps us recognize that European and Islamic history are not the only important stories in medieval world history. Understanding them reminds us that there were other sophisticated civilizations operating according to different logics, developing different solutions to problems of governance and military organization, achieving significant influence and cultural importance. They'd try to comfort you, but there would be nothing they could do. You'd die. Let's talk about what would happen to your body over time. Your body would be damaged by work. Your back would hurt. Your knees would hurt. Your hands would be calloused and scarred. Your feet would be scarred and damaged. Your skin would be weathered. You'd look old. You have premature aging from sun exposure and hard work. Your teeth would be terrible. They'd be rotten. They'd hurt. You'd have infections. You'd lose teeth one by one. By middle age, you'd have few or no teeth. Eating would be difficult. Your nutrition would suffer even more. Your hair would be gray. You'd have wrinkles. You'd be stooped from years of bending over while working. This work of historical recovery is important not just for understanding the Khazars themselves, but for understanding history more broadly. Every civilization that we recover from historical obscurity expands our understanding of what's possible, of how different societies solve problems, of the range of human achievement and organization. The Khazars are one such civilization, sophisticated, innovative, influential, deserving of remembrance. The enduring significance of this historical moment. The encounter between Vikings and Khazars was a pivotal moment in medieval history, even though most people don't know about it. It was a moment when two different civilizations came into contact and had to figure out how to coexist and interact. It was a moment when military power met organizational sophistication, and the result surprised a more militarily aggressive party. But beyond the specific historical moment, the encounter has broader significance. It reveals something important about how civilizations actually work, how power is actually distributed, and how change actually happens. It teaches us lessons that apply far beyond the medieval world. First, it teaches us about the limits of violence as a problem-solving tool. The Vikings were formidable warriors. Violence was their primary tool for achieving objectives. But when they encountered an opponent who refused to let them use violence on terms that favored them, they had to find a different approach. This is a lesson that applies to any domain where one party is trying to impose its will on another. Pure force, untempered by understanding of your opponent and by willingness to adapt, often proves insufficient. Second, it teaches us about the power of organization and coordination. The Khazars weren't stronger individually than Vikings. They weren't more numerous. They weren't more aggressive or more courageous. What they had was better organization, the ability to coordinate complex operations, to subordinate individual actions to larger strategic goals, to maintain discipline and doctrine. This organizational advantage multiplied their power effectiveness far beyond what raw strength would suggest. This principle appears repeatedly in history and in modern organizational contexts. Third, it teaches us about the importance of trade and peaceful interaction. The Viking and Khazar story ended not with one side destroying the other, but with both sides recognizing that cooperation was more profitable than warfare. This principle has driven much of human history. When trade becomes possible, it often overwhelms military conflict as a way of interacting with other peoples. The most prosperous societies throughout history have been those with extensive trade networks. Fourth, it teaches us about the dangers of assuming inevitable victory. The Vikings have been successful everywhere they've previously gone. Time was a repetition of sacred patterns. But there was also an understanding that time was running out. The apocalypse was coming. The end times were approaching. This created a particular anxiety about time. On one level, time was cyclical and eternal. On another level, time was finite and ending. These two understandings existed simultaneously, without being reconciled. Medieval people believed in cyclical time and linear time at the same time. They believed in eternity and in the ending of all things. The concept of a deadline didn't exist, but the concept of when God decides definitely did. Your harvest would be ready when it was ready. Your child would be born when God decided. Your life would end when God decided. It allowed them to attract talent and skills from diverse populations. It allowed them to maintain relationships with diverse neighbors. It allowed them to facilitate commerce between different peoples. The Vikings, as they settled in Eastern Europe, gradually adopted local customs and mixed with local populations rather than trying to maintain genetic or cultural purity. This flexibility made them more successful in establishing permanent settlements. 6. It teaches us about the provisional nature of power. The Khazars were powerful and sophisticated, but ultimately their power proved provisional and temporary. Parenting would be stressful and difficult. Let's talk about what would happen as you aged. As you got older, you'd be less able to work. Your body would give out. You wouldn't be able to do as much labor. Your income would decrease. You'd be struggling even more to survive. You'd be in constant pain. You'd be increasingly dependent on others. You'd be a burden to your family. And there would be no retirement. You'd work until you couldn't work anymore. Then you'd be dependent on your children or on charity. You'd be poor and old and broken. You'd be waiting to die. Let's talk about the role of storytelling in medieval life. Stories were important. They were the entertainment. They were the way knowledge was passed down. They encountered an opponent they couldn't defeat militarily and had the wisdom to recognize this and adapt their strategy. They became merchants and traders as well as warriors and raiders. They became settlers and rulers as well as explorers and raiders. This adaptability made them extraordinarily influential in Eastern Europe. The Khazars demonstrated that sophisticated organization and coordinated action can overcome military aggression. They showed that multicultural governance was possible and beneficial. They showed that trade networks could be the foundation for power and prosperity. They maintained their independence and their cultural integrity for centuries through military sophistication and governmental excellence. When these two civilizations encountered each other, they were forced to adapt. The Vikings adapted by recognizing that cooperation was more profitable than conquest. The Khazars adapted by recognizing that the Vikings could be integrated into their economic system rather than simply destroyed or expelled. Both sides benefited from the encounter. This historical moment, largely forgotten today, shaped the development of Eastern Europe, influenced the development of Russian civilization, and demonstrated principles about power and organization that remain relevant today. It's a story worth remembering. It's a story that teaches important lessons. It's a story that deserves a place in how we understand medieval history and how we understand the nature of power and human organization more broadly. The Vikings and Khazars remind us that history is more interesting, more complex, and more instructive than simplified narratives often suggest. They remind us that there were multiple centers of power in medieval Eurasia operating according to different logics and achieving different solutions to the problems of organization, defense, and prosperity. They remind us that pragmatism and adaptation are often more effective than pride and stubbornness. They remind us that surprising encounters can force both parties to grow and adapt in ways that ultimately benefit both. The sea was a place of absolute danger, a place where normal rules didn't apply, a place where you might die horribly or encounter the impossible. For people who lived near the coast, the sea was slightly less abstract but no less terrifying. Fishing was dangerous. Men drowned constantly. A fishing boat could disappear in a sudden storm. A man could fall overboard and vanish. The sea was acknowledged as necessary for food and commerce, but it was also seen as fundamentally hostile. The sea didn't want humans in it. Humans who entered the sea were taking their lives into their hands. They were risking everything. Navigation was terrifying. Medieval ships didn't have compasses. They didn't have maps that were accurate. The question for us is whether we will learn these lessons and apply them to the challenges we face today. A note on sources and historical interpretation. Understanding the Vikings and Khazars requires working with sources that are often fragmentary and written from perspectives outside the cultures being described. This creates both challenges and opportunities for historical understanding. Much of what we know about Khazar military practices comes from Byzantine sources describing their interactions with the Khazars. Byzantine historians observed Khazar forces and wrote about what they saw, but these accounts are filtered through Byzantine perspectives and Byzantine military understanding. Similarly, Arab geographers and historians wrote about the Khazars and their territories, but again from external perspectives. When Vikings eventually developed written literacy and produced sagas and chronicles, these sources often provide valuable information, but sagas were written generations after events and often emphasized drama and heroic narrative over historical precision. Despite these limitations, we can piece together a reasonably coherent picture of how these civilizations operated by combining multiple sources, examining archaeological evidence, and using logical inference about what military and economic practices would have been necessary for societies to function as they apparently did. The military organization described in this script represents our best understanding based on available evidence. Byzantine descriptions of Khazar forces, archaeological evidence of fortifications, references in medieval texts to specific military tactics, and inference about what organizational structures would be necessary to maintain stable rule across vast territories all contribute to this picture. We may not know every detail, but we can be reasonably confident that the Khazars did have professional military forces, did maintain fortification networks, and did operate with a level of organizational sophistication that most contemporary medieval forces lacked. They expected suffering. This resignation allowed them to survive. They could endure because they didn't expect things to be different. Medieval people were also more spiritual. They lived in a world populated by spirits and demons and divine forces. They experienced the world as fundamentally mysterious and supernatural. They believed that prayer could change outcomes. They believed that God intervened in their lives. This spirituality gave their lives meaning even if the circumstances were terrible. Medieval people were also more communal. They thought of themselves as part of a community first, and as individuals second. Their identity was tied to their family and their village. This approach to history, working with incomplete sources, filling gaps through careful reasoning and presenting interpretations while acknowledging uncertainty, is what historians actually do. It's less dramatic than presenting history as a series of certain facts, but it's more intellectually honest and more useful for actual understanding.